My first idea was thinking up a way as to how I could represent common insults that aim towards women within my animation. This is because I personally view misogynistic insults as one reason why feminism is still needed in today's society. Due to the fact that these words demonize women, therefore making them appear to be some sort of threat, I decided the colour red would be a good way to highlight how negative they can be. Here you can see me trying to write out the words slut and whore, as I feel these are probably the worst insults a woman can get, and I really wanted to try and shape the impact they could have by making them big and bold, and shaping them in a slightly disorientated way. After experimenting with words, I decided to move on to how I could represent patriarchy in my animation. I felt the colour black was a good way to represent it, as feminists like myself see it as something negative or even evil at times. The reason it spreads all over the white stage is to show that it is literally everywhere and affects everyone, not just women. What you're watching now is me making each new keyframe and adding more to the circle within the middle of the stage. However, the more I added to it, the more it went off the stage, so I had to make sure I aligned each individual circle, meaning I had to highlight each individual frame and center it into the stage so that it was directly in the middle. The more I developed the circle, however, the more it lost its shape, and instead of erasing the sides to make it more circular, I decided to add on the bumps and the ripples and just make it spread more evenly across the stage. I then put these two experiments together to see how they would turn out. I made it so the words would appear to grow out of the black, implying that any insults directed mostly at women originate from within patriarchal societies. What I'm doing right now is quite common in animation, where you replay what you already have made just to see how it looks and how you could add to it in any way. In the end, this wasn't exactly how I imagined my animation to be, so I decided to develop my ideas more. I referred back to Judy Chicago's work involving hands to express her views on feminism and female-related power, and went on from there. After drawing several pieces of art involving hands in various positions and movements, I came up with the idea of a slightly clenched hand representing feminism, stripping away the black screen, symbolising the patriarchy. The hand being drawn right now won't be used in the final animation, it's simply to show myself as I draw where I need to erase the black later on, hence why I'm using red to show where these erasings will be. I'm not particularly fond of making my animations look completely perfect straight away. This is simply an experiment. Now that I have erased the red, I'm left with the bottom white layer. This means that anything underneath the black and above the white layer will be shown as soon as the hand has finished stripping away the black. Once the movement of the hand and the erasing of the black was done, it hadn't completely taken the black off the stage, so I felt like replicating a more forceful action to remove it. In this case, the action of punching glass, causing it to shatter. Here I am again replaying the footage that I've already done, without the words this time however, and seeing how the stripping and punching have worked out. After organising the frames for this part, I continued to try and add more to who the fist belonged to, as another experiment as to what my animation could be. As you can see here, I'm just trying to draw a body and a head. However, I'm not paying much attention to detail, as this is simply an idea, a possibility, not a certainty towards the end of my final piece. When my idea progresses, I start to imagine giving feminism a face. Maybe this animation will follow the life of a feminist. Once these areas were both complete, I decided to merge them together. As you can see, I've added harsher words, and I'm trying to make it so the white completely removes the words. However, in the end it doesn't exactly work out how I want it to. Rather than forcing the current ideas to succeed, I decided to make something new and develop my animation from there, but still taking into account all the ideas that I have made already. Here are a few experiments I produced, simply to practice my skills before starting the most recent idea I had in mind at the time. idea for what my final animation piece would centre around eventually started to come together after the previous footage just shown. This was because of what I was learning about gender representation within my media studies lessons. Throughout the majority of my essays, I have often referred to Laura Mulvey, a British feminist film theorist, and her theory of the male gaze. Before we go into this, however, I'd first like to start by determining what gaze defines as in media terms. It's fair to say that the concept of gaze is one that deals with how the audience views the way people are presented on screen. For feminists, it can be sectioned in three ways: how men look at women, how women look at themselves, and how women look at other women. Mulvey's male gaze theory is the idea that film audiences have to view characters from the perspective of the heterosexual male. One feature of the male gaze would be the fact that the camera lingers on certain areas of the female body. This includes eyes, lips, neck, breasts, hips, the bottom, the crotch, thighs, ankles, and maybe even the feet. These fragmented shots result in making the woman on screen a victim of sexual objectification. This means that the audience would be forced to see the woman as a depersonalized object of desire instead of an individual with a complex personality and desires or plans of their own. In my log, I have produced several examples of research showing how male gaze and objectification of women is so frequent in today's society. It is for this reason that I feel to truly express the social and political need for feminism, I have to highlight the negativity of the male gaze within my animated final piece. Not only will I look at it from a film theorist perspective, but I will also explore how the male gaze can be applied through male-dominant areas of society. What you're watching right now is me animating a mouth saying, "Can you hear us?" I felt this was a good idea because, one, it shows a fragmented shot of something that the male gaze focuses on, but two, it also silences the mouth, which is what the male gaze is responsible for. In other words, objectification silences those who are victim of it. In my animation, the voices would be replaced with music. After adding words as an experiment and touching up the introduction titles, I moved on to seeing how the mouth could form into another feature of the body that the male gaze might focus on. Here I am morphing a closed mouth into two closed eyes, which I later then animate to open to reflect vulnerability and innocence lost through the male gaze and objectification. I then began to think about how I could introduce colour into my animation. I started by focusing on a new way to bring in the title. I decided to use the colours red and blue mostly because red usually refers to femininity and blue usually refers to masculinity in gender stereotypes. One way I decided to reflect feminism was to make these two colours blur together, not only to show diversity in feminism, but also highlight the view that gender is more of a spectrum than something you can categorise into two separate binaries. My animation is called Gaze because it focuses on the action of looking. I decided to see what adjustments I could make to develop what I had so far by adding different colours and experimenting more with words. I started my animation for a final time and finally understood how I wanted one sequence to lead to another, but still keeping a reference to the male gaze, objectification, patriarchy, and how feminism is trying to overcome all three of these things that link together. Although the mouth is now saying, "Can you hear me?" it's simply to reflect how patriarchy completely destroys unity and equality. The reason the mouth is now smiling a lot more than the original is because I wanted to reflect how the male gaze can, in this case, make a mouth saying something quite sinister appear to be saying something quite playful or seductive. I proceeded to fill the stage with the same mouth animation to reflect how many voices are lost through the male gaze and objectification. The process of copying this mouth animation is through symbols, which allow me to replicate certain frames and then paste them anywhere in the stage that I want. As you can see here, I'm morphing the mouth from before into an eye to symbolise how voices are lost and replaced with the assumptions people make through looking at the characters on screen. What you're watching now is the final animation sequence. I moved on to see how I could reflect unawareness about the male gaze into my animation, as well as the potential risks objectification can cause. As you can see here, I'm covering over the eye with the colour black, not only to symbolise patriarchy like we said before, but also how people are ignorant about the male gaze and the risks of objectification, which I've decided to show through the hand, as this is what we use to touch, feel, grab, and claim as our own. This is what objectification does. It makes people believe, subconsciously mostly, that they can just do whatever they want to those who are objectified. Which, if you look at any magazine or film or media text, it is almost always the female body that is made to appear to be a sexual object of desire. What you're viewing right here is my animation so far. I decided to make one sequence always lead to another. So once the gaze phase out, the mouths come in, and once the mouths morph into the eyes morph into the hands to cover the screen. This is to show how male gaze and objectification link and intertwine with patriarchy. I knew I wanted to bring the point mentioned earlier about the female body into my animation, but at first I wasn't completely sure how I could. So I began to roughly sketch out what I thought was an accurate representation of what the male gaze does to a female body. This involves making the shot focus only on her body and not her face, which shows her identity. This is often referred to as objectification because it takes away her humanity and instead makes her appear to be an object just to look at. After briefly looking into the style of Kara Walker's pieces, black and white silhouetted figures on opposing backgrounds, I decided to see how I could add this into my own work. Here is me drawing a white silhouette of a woman, which symbolises the ideal image women are expected to keep up to in order to be accepted by society. Eventually I started to make it so the figure would grow out of the black screen, implying that ideal images of women come from patriarchal influences on the media. I did this by erasing parts of the body in each key frame and then reversing said frames. Here I am animating some eyes, yet again symbolising the male gaze. However, this time they are red because they hold lust for the female figure in the middle. The red colour also refers to how dangerous the male gaze can be because they always focus on these ideal images of women and never seem to show any diversity. However, I eventually changed the colour to blue because I wanted to represent it more towards the male gender binary. I animated it so that the fist would appear after the female silhouette vanishes, to symbolise how feminism is strongly against ideal images of women, because that implies it is the only way to look and be accepted and be loved, when that is not the case at all. Once I had finished this sequence, I moved on to see how I could develop the representation of gender binaries through the colours used before. But first I tried to experiment as to how I could represent objectification of the female body, as this is a key point I want to highlight in my final piece. Here I am drawing a female body while trying to bring in detail. I do try to see how I could symbolise objectification by removing a head or disorientating it. However, this doesn't exactly go the way I want it to, so I go back to the first point that I said. Here you can see me drawing two circles and then a red triangle to signify the breasts and the hips, which are mainly focused on during when the male gaze is present. Eventually these two shapes form into the female body. I made it so that she doesn't have a head to signify how objectification takes away one's identity. As we move on, I start to draw the male, and this time I start from the head to give him a identity, a voice, and just to show that he's not affected by the male gaze. The reason there is multiple figures in this sequence is to show how a multiple of men and women are represented in the mainstream media this way. The hand being drawn here represents equality. However, the changing colours, which refer back to the spectrum I drew earlier, refer to the diversity within equality. Black crosses, however, eventually cover this hand to show how patriarchy completely destroys any kind of equality or diversity due to its structure of gender binaries and gender stereotypes and gender roles. I wanted to try and reflect feminism's effect on the patriarchy, so I decided to animate what is about to be shown. Kara Walker's style has really helped me develop my ideas for my animation. I feel it is important to note now that although I did really enjoy Barbara Kruger's use of text in her work, I decided that involving words in my animation would simply take away the silencing impact the male gaze has on a woman on screen. Here I am animating a replicated hand from before to appear as though it is being generated from the black. This implies that patriarchy creates things that may appear acceptable but is actually just a made-up social construct. Feminism's effect on it is symbolised through the glitchy effect shown, and it shows how strong feminism is against something made up by patriarchy. Here I am using a method I learnt through my experiments. which involves making a circle grow so that it takes over the screen. However, this time, instead of the black taking over the screen, I have made it so a purple circle does. This is to symbolise feminism overcoming patriarchy. I eventually start to use the colours red and blue again to highlight how if two of the gender binaries work together, then feminism will grow and eventually overcome patriarchy completely. Here I am drawing a fist, but not paying much attention to detail to reflect how feminism started with a simple purpose. However, I eventually made it so that it changed into a more detailed fist, implying how feminism has changed so much over time and has become so much more than when it began. I decided to bring in one more experiment from before, as I wanted to symbolise the freedom gender equality can bring through a hand waving. This hand represents freedom because it's as if it's just caught in a breeze and there's nothing that can prevent it from swinging back and forth. The fact that it changes colour through the spectrum I made earlier refers to how gender equality involves everyone, whether they identify as male or female or neither or both. We have to understand that gender equality and gender identity isn't just limited to the two binaries. As the black screen returns, it shows the generating effects used before to reflect that our current society, represented through the colour white, is built from patriarchy. However, yet again, I have animated glitchy imagery, implying that the patriarchal society is failing. Before the patriarchal society completely vanishes, however, I decided to animate several more seats with the colours red and blue, representing the two gender binaries. The screen immediately snaps to a red figure representing the female gender, who at first seems to be doing nothing out of the ordinary. However, as soon as the blue figure, symbolising the male gender and the male gaze, enter the screen, the female figure loses her head, therefore her identity, and it is transferred to the male's hand, implying that within patriarchal societies, a woman is more like property to a man rather than an individual. The figures have now lost their shape to show how reality and patriarchal ideologies are so different and don't coexist. By this I mean patriarchal societies are made up by man and have a certain order and structure, whereas reality is just abstract and doesn't conform to the categories we make up. Here I have started to merge the two figures together and form a heart shape to symbolise how love and respect can bring about gender equality. Eventually the colours and the shapes merge together and drag out the black from the screen to symbolise how feminism can and will eventually overcome patriarchy. However, right now this is not the case in today's society, so despite the current positivity in my animation, I have decided to end it on a negative note and allow the spectator to reflect on this. Before concluding the animation, I felt it would be a good idea to reflect the potential of feminism and neutral gender representation by reuniting the figures for a final time and once again merging them together. You can probably tell by now that I've completely gotten rid of the male gaze in my animation, as I want to truly represent gender equality by bringing the two genders together and forming feminism through making them love each other and respect each other and view each other equally. And now we have reached the end of my animation. The final segment shows a purple figure representing feminism separating into the two coloured figures as the white shatters around it, only leaving the black to devour and claim the genders as its own. The two hands in the background that were originally together are now separated and are angled to show how males are dominant over women in patriarchal societies. The gap between the two figures symbolises how, although feminism is relevant in today's society, patriarchal ideologies overcomes it in the end, leaving the two genders apart, when in reality they are more complicated and closer than we are made to believe.